Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 823 condemning the government of Iran's state-sponsored persecution of its Baha'i minority and its continued violation of the International Covenant on Human Rights, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 823, resolution condemning the government of Iran's state-sponsored persecution of its Baha'i minority and its continued violation of the International Covenants on Human Rights.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution condemning the government of Iran's persecution of its besieged Baha'i minority. The government of Iran has carried out an inhumane campaign of religious persecution against the Baha'i minority, its largest non-Muslim religious minority in the country. The regime has closed Baha'i-owned shops and stores, forbidden Baha'i citizens from holding government jobs, and denied Baha'i children access to school. Members of the Baha'i community have been unjustly arrested and prosecuted and executed, targeted solely for their religious beliefs. The U.S. stands for the freedom of religious exercise, and we must speak up in the face of this theocratic injustice. We cannot forget those who struggle for their basic religious freedom and civil liberty in Iran. This resolution sends a strong message to the Iranian government that the government of the United States will not remain silent in the face of such terrible oppression. It calls for the immediate release of all imprisoned or detained Baha'is and urges sanctions on Iranian officials and others who are responsible for these human rights abuses, including abuses against the Baha'i community. I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting this bipartisan resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Today we focus on the regime's religious persecution of the Baha'i, Iran's largest religious minority group. The Baha'i in Iran are regularly subject to arbitrary interrogations and arrests without due process. They are often denied employment and access to higher education. Their cemeteries have been vandalized, and many of their leaders have been executed. Moreover, Iranian state media publishes anti-Baha'i hate propaganda, exposing them to prejudices and even potentially violent attacks by their neighbors. The Iranian regime must end their persecution of the Baha'i by releasing those who have been illegally imprisoned, by ending their hate-filled propaganda campaign against the Baha'i, and by reversing policies that the Baha'i is equal opportunity. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance
on this very important topic. I rise today in strong support of H.Res. 823, which condemns the Iranian government's persecution of the Baha'i minority. As an original co-sponsor of this measure myself, I want to thank Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Wilson for their work to bring it to the floor today. As a former chairman of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee myself, I've long observed how the Iranian government has repressed its own people, stifled their voices and their freedoms, and systematically abused human rights. Nowhere is this more evident than in the mullahs' persecution of members of the Baha'i faith. Since the Iranian Revolution, Iran has executed hundreds of Baha'i, while 10,000 Baha'i have been dismissed from their jobs, and a number of their holy sites have been desecrated. Baha'i also have seen their homes and businesses raided, their children prohibited from attending college, and their property confiscated. This cruel persecution comes despite the fact that Iran has nothing to fear from the Baha'i. The Baha'i faith espouses the values of peace and unity, cooperation, education, interfaith harmony, and an end to prejudice. Wherever Baha'i live, they strive to be good citizens, devoted to service and universal respect for all people. This includes here in the United States. Since arriving over 120 years ago, members of the Baha'i faith have established themselves as patriotic and productive citizens in all 50 states. I want to specifically honor the Baha'i community in my community in Cincinnati. They have one of their churches right down the street, about a mile down the street from my home. And I've had the opportunity to meet their representatives several times and come to learn how they have enriched our city here in the city of Cincinnati back home. With these values and contributions in mind, the Iranian persecution of the Baha'i is clearly barbaric and shows the true nature of that wicked regime in Iran. So I would urge my colleagues to join me and join others on both sides of the aisle in condemning the persecution by supporting this resolution. And I yield back.
Mr. Wilson for their hard work on this important resolution. American foreign policy must work to advance and protect basic human rights around the world, including religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities. When we see human rights violations like the ones the Iranian government has inflicted on the Baha'i community, we must speak out, we must pursue justice for the victims, and we must hold the perpetrators accountable. We must defend people nonviolently exercising their faith against governments violently imposing their will on the public. This resolution is a step in the direction of aggressive defense of human rights, and I'm pleased to support it. I urge all of our colleagues to support this bipartisan measure, and I now yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 823 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended.